about it. Writing isn't just a skill you learn for school reports, is it?
Not at all.
It's how we share ideas, tell our stories, even how we persuade others, like throughout our lives. So what gets those little fingers moving in the first place? What's the spark that makes a young student want to write?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Hmm.
We spend so much energy teaching the mechanics of writing, the grammar, the structure, but that initial drive, that motivation to actually engage with it well, that's what really lays the groundwork for developing strong writers. Skills are important, yes, but it's that inner persistence that keeps them going.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. Forget general theories for a moment. We've got this really interesting systematic review. It looked at 56 different research studies published over a couple of decades, from 1996 to 2020.
Right.
And the really cool thing is it focuses specifically on how young students themselves, kids in kindergarten through fifth grade, report on what motivates them to write.
What's fascinating here, I think, is that this puts the young writers front and center. Instead of us guessing or relying solely on, say, teacher observations,
Yeah.
this research compilation looks at how these children actually articulate their own reasons for wanting to write or maybe not wanting to write.
So for you, our listener, our mission today is to understand how researchers have tried to tap into the inner world of these young writers. What have they learned by actually listening to the kids about what drives them? And ultimately, what can we take away from this that might help us better support young learners on their writing journey? It's kind of like getting a backstage pass to their thoughts on writing.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding what motivates these young learners isn't just some academic exercise. It has real-world implications for how we approach teaching and encouraging writing, both in the classroom and at home.
It absolutely does, because the research hints at something that might resonate with a lot of us. It seems like young kids often start out really enthusiastic about writing, right? They've got this natural intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, that initial excitement.
But then as they move through the grades and experience more formal instruction, maybe more focus on assessment,
Right.
that drive can sometimes shift towards just trying to get good grades, what they call extrinsic motivation.
This brings up a key question then. Why does this shift in motivation seem to occur for some young writers? And the review points out a bit of a puzzle.
Okay.
Unlike in reading research where there's quite a bit on motivation shifts, we don't have as many in-depth, long-term studies that really track how and why writing motivation might decrease as children progress through school.
Huh. That definitely feels like a gap in our understanding. Now, before we look at how they actually assess this motivation, the review does outline the main things that researchers in this area have been focusing on. Can you give us a quick overview of those key components?
Sure. Researchers often look at four main areas when it comes to writing motivation. First, there are self-efficacy beliefs, which is basically a child's confidence in their own ability to write successfully.
Okay, they're I can do this feeling.
Exactly. Second is goal orientations. What are they trying to achieve when they write? Are they focused on learning and improving, mastering the skill? Or are they just focused on getting a good mark, performing well?
Makes sense.
Third is task, interest, and value. How much do they actually enjoy the act of writing itself, and how important do they believe writing is? And finally, outcome attributions. How do they explain their successes and failures in writing? Do they attribute it to their own effort or their ability, or maybe just luck, or how hard the task was?
Okay, that gives us a good framework.
Yeah.
So with those in mind, how have researchers actually tried to get kids to tell them about these inner feelings and beliefs? What kinds of writing tasks were they asking about in these studies?
Well, what stands out quite clearly from the review is the overwhelming focus on storytelling, or narrative writing. Yeah, the review found that a significant number, 17 out of the 56 studies, used this genre as the primary way to explore writing motivation in young students.
17 out of 56. Wow, that's a pretty big slice of the pie. What about all the other types of writing kids encounter in school, like reports or explanations?
Exactly. That's the thing. While narrative writing was the dominant focus, other genres were explored, but honestly, much less frequently. There were, 5 studies that looked at expository writing,
Okay.
2 that focused on informational or explanatory writing, and just a single study that dealt with descriptive writing.
That really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Because even in those early grades, kids are writing for different purposes all the time. What were some of the other writing activities that did pop up in these studies, even if less often?
Well, there was a decent variety beyond those main genres. Some studies used letter writing as the task. Others looked at more open-ended, authentic writing tasks,
Hmm.
things meant to mirror real-world writing. There were also studies that incorporated linguistic games, poetry writing, even collaborative writing projects where students wrote together.
Okay.
And some researchers specifically manipulated the difficulty of the writing task, looking at motivation when students faced either high challenge or low challenge assignments.
So a range of tasks, but still that really strong tilt towards narratives. And when they asked about motivation, were they usually talking about like a specific writing activity they just did, or did some studies take a broader view, writing in general?
That's an important distinction they found. Some studies ask very general questions about writing, for instance, what do you think makes you a good writer? Or do you like writing? That sort of thing.
Right.
Others were much more focused, asking about motivation in relation to the specific writing task they had just completed, like how motivated were you to write that story we just finished? The Reviews Table 3 actually has more examples of both types of questions they used.
Interesting. It makes you think, doesn't it? This heavy emphasis on storytelling. Could that be, maybe, shaping what we think we understand about young kids' writing motivation?
Well, yeah.
Maybe what drives them to write a story is totally different from what might motivate them to write, say, an explanation of something they've learned in science.
Precisely. This potential overrepresentation of narrative writing in the research
Hmm.
does raise a significant point. If a child isn't particularly drawn to creative storytelling, does that automatically mean they lack motivation for all types of writing?
Good question.
What about the child who loves explaining how things work or describing something in detail? Our current understanding might be somewhat skewed if we're primarily looking through the lens of narrative.
Definitely an aha moment there, I think. So, beyond the type of writing task, what specific aspects of motivation were these researchers actually trying to measure when they asked these questions? You mentioned the four broad components earlier.
Right. Well, the review identified a really broad spectrum, get this, 32 different motivational constructs in total.
32. Wow. How did they make sense of all that?
To help organize this, they grouped them into what they called theorized components of motivation, which include things we've touched on, like interest and value, self-beliefs about writing ability, and overall motivation towards writing.
Okay.
Then they also looked at associated constructs, such as general attitude towards writing, self-efficacy, again, that belief in one's ability, and also just motivation as a kind of general factor they were trying to measure.
32. That sounds like a really complex landscape to navigate. Were there any of these constructs that researchers seem to look at more often than others?
Yes, definitely. The constructs that were investigated most frequently were attitude towards writing, which appeared in 20 of the studies.
Okay, nearly half.
Yeah. Then self-efficacy in 11 studies, and the general concept of motivation in 9 studies. Table 4 in the review provides a complete list of all 32 if anyone wants to dig deeper.
Okay, so it seems like how kids feel about writing, their attitude, and how confident they are in their abilities, their self-efficacy, are really key areas of interest for researchers.
Seems that way.
Now, how did they actually ask about these things? What methods did they use to get kids to share their thoughts and feelings?
The 3 main methods used were interviews with students, surveys or questionnaires, and what the review terms alternative written responses.
Right.
Interviews were used in 32 of the studies. Surveys and questionnaires were actually the most common, appearing in 46 studies. And it's interesting, the review notes that researchers often use those two terms, surveys and questionnaires, interchangeably.
Okay.
And finally, alternative written responses, which could include things like completing sentence starters about writing, or maybe reflecting on their writing process in written form. Those were used in 5 studies.
So a real mix of ways to try and tap into these young minds. Can you give us some concrete examples of what these methods look like in practice? Like what kind of interview question or survey item?
Absolutely. So in interviews, a researcher might ask open-ended questions designed to uncover a student's beliefs about themselves as a writer. Maybe something like, what are some things you feel you do well when you write?
Hmm.
Or to understand their preferences, like what kinds of things do you enjoy writing about the most? Surveys often used Likert scales, where students would indicate their level of agreement with statements like, I like to write, on a scale from maybe not at all to a lot.
Right, the classic scale.
Exactly. And for the alternative written responses, one study had students complete the sentence, writing is like, because, which can provide really insightful and sometimes, surprising metaphorical descriptions of how they view writing. Table 5 in the review offers even more specific examples of the actual questions and prompts used.
That writing is like because prompt is fascinating. It really encourages a different kind of thinking, doesn't it?
It does. Very creative.
And were these methods mostly newly created for these studies, or were researchers generally using and perhaps adapting existing tools?
It was actually a fairly even split, which is interesting in itself. The review found that researchers used previously developed motivational measures 41 times, either in their original form or with some modifications.
Okay.
But surprisingly, new measures were developed specifically for the purposes of the study 42 times. So yeah, almost a 50-50 breakdown.
Huh. That's quite a bit of new measure development.
Like
What
that.
kinds of changes were they making to those existing measures when they decided to adapt them instead of starting from scratch?
Well, the adaptations included things like translating measures into different languages, obviously,
Right.
to suit the study population,
Sure.
simplifying the language of the questions to make them more accessible for younger students, and even taking questions from measures that were originally designed to assess motivation in other areas, like reading,
Hmm.
and just rewording them slightly to apply to writing.
Right.
However, a key point the review highlights is that the specifics of these modifications weren't always clearly detailed in the research reports.
Ah, okay. And I can see how that lack of clarity could make it harder to compare findings across different studies if you don't know exactly how a measure was changed.
Exactly, it muddies the waters a bit.
Now, a really important aspect of this whole review, as we mentioned up front, is its focus on the students' voices. How much of a central priority was that really in these 56 studies? Did they truly focus on what the kids said?
That's a critical point, and the answer is it varied. While all of the studies included some form of self-report from the students, the extent to which those voices were truly emphasized or maybe isolated varied quite a bit.
How so?
Well, some studies relied almost entirely on what the students themselves reported through interviews or questionnaires. That was their main data source.
Okay.
However, a significant number of other studies used a technique called triangulation. This means they collected data from multiple sources, like teachers, the researchers themselves through observations, sometimes even parents in addition to the students.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't always just about what the kids were saying on their own. It was mixed with adult perspectives sometimes.
Precisely. And in some of those studies that use multiple sources, the review noted that it wasn't always crystal clear how much weight was given to each different perspective when the researchers presented their findings.
Hmm.
For instance, a study might mention collecting data from student interviews, teacher surveys, and researcher observations, but then present the results in a way that didn't really differentiate clearly. This came from the students, this from the teachers. It makes it harder to really pinpoint the students' own views sometimes.
That's like trying to sort out different ingredients in a soup after it's already cooked. You know they're all there, but you can't necessarily taste each one distinctly.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Were there any instances mentioned where what the students reported seemed to kind of contradict what the adults, like teachers or researchers, were saying or observing?
Yes, there were a few interesting examples of such discrepancies noted in the review. One study, for instance, looked at the impact of a particular letter writing program.
Okay.
And they found that while the teachers reported feeling that the program had significantly boosted the students' motivation to write letters,
Right.
the students' own responses on surveys didn't necessarily show that same level of increased motivation. There was a disconnect.
Wow. That's a really valuable insight, isn't it? It kind of underscores why getting the direct perspective from the students themselves is so important, even if it doesn't always align perfectly with adult perceptions of their motivation.
Absolutely. It highlights the potential pitfalls of relying solely on secondhand reports.
Did the review also look at whether any of these studies compared writing motivation to motivation in other academic areas, like reading, for example?
They did. 7 of the studies included measures of reading motivation alongside writing motivation.
And what did they find there?
The trend they found was quite interesting. In the majority of those cases, the young students reported feeling more motivated to read than they did to write.
Huh. Any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, the review authors suggest a couple of possible explanations. It could be, perhaps, that students feel there's a kind of social expectation to say they like writing, even if they don't as much as reading.
Hmm.
Or maybe when they are directly asked to compare the two, they feel more comfortable expressing a genuine preference. It's hard to say for sure.
That's a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of self-reporting, especially with young children, social desirability and all that.
Hmm.
And how did the researchers handle all this different self-report data? You mentioned surveys, interviews. Did they just group everything together, or did they try to analyze the different types of responses in different ways?
It varied. Some studies did combine different self-report methods strategically. For example, they might use surveys with larger groups of students to get broad quantitative data like frequencies or levels of motivation.
Right, the numbers.
Exactly. And then they might conduct more in-depth interviews with a smaller subset of those students to really explore the reasons and factors behind those survey responses, the qualitative side. The sample sizes often differed depending on the method used. Surveys typically involved more participants, while interviews were usually conducted with smaller, more focused groups.
So a real mix and match approach depending on what they were trying to find out. But it sounds like the key takeaway here regarding student voice is that for future research to be really informative about students' perspectives, it needs to be much clearer about whose voices are being presented and how those different viewpoints contribute to the overall understanding.
Absolutely. The review really emphasizes the critical need for future researchers to be transparent about who provided the data when presenting the results and drawing conclusions. This clarity is just essential for truly understanding the student's perspective on their own writing motivation.
Okay, so we've talked about the types of writing tasks used, how motivation has been measured, and the varying degrees to which students' voices were prioritized. If we zoom out now, what are the main overall takeaways from this deep dive into these 56 studies? What are the big picture insights?
Well, to summarize the key findings, I'd say the review highlights first that strong prevalence of storytelling tasks in research on writing motivation in young students.
Right, the narrative focus.
Second, the incredibly wide range of different motivational aspects, those 32 constructs that have been studied, maybe without enough synthesis sometimes.
Mm.
Third, the surprisingly frequent use of new and often not fully validated self-report measures. And finally, the fact that the emphasis on truly capturing and reporting students' own perspectives has varied considerably across studies.
That point about I think the review used the word reckless use of unvalidated measures really stood out. Can you elaborate a bit more on why that's such a significant concern for the field?
Reckless is a strong word, but it highlights a serious issue. It's a major concern because if we're using tools to measure motivation that haven't been properly tested, to ensure they are actually measuring what we think they're measuring and that the results are consistent and reliable,
Right.
then the findings of those studies become questionable. It's like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation. You can't trust the structure. This can really hinder progress in the field because we can't be confident that we're building on reliable knowledge. We may be drawing conclusions based on faulty data.
Makes perfect sense. And what about the use of different visual aids in some of these self-report measures? You mentioned things like stuffed animals or the happy and sad faces earlier. Were there any potential issues identified there?
Yes, the review does raise concerns about what's known as construct irrelevant variants when using diverse and sometimes not well-validated pictorial supports.
Construct irrelevant variants. What does that mean exactly?
It basically means that these visual aids, while intended to make it easier for young children to respond, might actually be influencing their answers in ways that don't truly reflect their underlying writing motivation. They might be measuring something else.
Ah, okay. Like what?
For example, they specifically mention Albert Bandura's caution against using simple happy or sad faces. The concern is that children might interpret those faces as reflecting their general emotional state at that moment, rather than, say, their specific confidence in their writing abilities or their interest in the writing task. So the measure isn't purely capturing motivation.
Gotcha. So even with the best intentions of making it easier for young kids to express themselves, we might be inadvertently introducing bias or noise into the results.
Exactly. It's a potential pitfall that needs careful consideration.
That's definitely something important for researchers and even us interpreting research to keep in mind. So based on all of this, the task bias, the measurement issues, the voice clarity, what do the authors of this review suggest for the future direction of research on writing motivation in young students? Where should the field go from here?
They emphasize several key areas for future focus. First, they really stress the need to actively counteract the current imbalance in writing tasks by including a much broader range of genres in motivation research, not just stories.
Right, look beyond narrative.
Second, they highlight the importance of researchers providing a clear and strong rationale for why they chose or designed a particular motivation measure, explicitly stating what specific aspects of motivation they intend to capture with that tool. No more ambiguity.
Be explicit about the construct.
Exactly. And finally, they reiterate the need for researchers to clearly report whose voices are being heard in their studies, students, teachers, observers, and to justify why that particular approach is appropriate for their research question and their overall design. Transparency is key.
All of that makes perfect sense. It sounds like the field is, continuing to develop. And by paying closer attention to these methodological considerations, the tasks, the measures, the voices, we can gain a much clearer and hopefully more accurate understanding of what truly motivates young writers.
Precisely. And ultimately, by really listening to and understanding their perspectives, we stand a much better chance of developing more effective and targeted ways to support their growth as writers and ideally foster a genuine interest and maybe even enjoyment in writing across different purposes and genres.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into how we understand what motivates young writers. It really makes you think about that fundamental question of why these young learners engage with writing, or maybe why they disengage in the first place.
Hmm.
So, for you, our listener, as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, maybe consider this. How might the ways in which writing is presented, taught, and assessed in our educational settings, both in school and maybe even informally at home, be unintentionally influencing students' motivation and their sense of themselves as capable writers?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah. What small but perhaps significant changes could we make, whether we're educators or parents or just interested observers, to better understand and nurture that inner drive to write across a wider range of formats and for a variety of real-world reasons? It's definitely a topic worth exploring further on your own. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.